Hello and welcome to the February edition of On the Horizon, our monthly podcast dedicated to helping you to navigate through the tricking world of golf course turf maintenance by helping you to look and think a little further forward. I'm Henry Beshley from ICL.
And I'm Glenn Kirby from Syngenta. Well, Henry, it's February, and does grass growth still have a chance? Can microdochium still advance? But don't worry, there's still time for a little romance.
Steady on, Glenn. Oh, you're referring to Valentine's Day being in February. And I like the romance rhyme very much.
Yeah, I had to squeeze romance in. Didn't really rhyme.
No,
I'm running out of rhymes.
That was a bit like discuss, which you did previously.
It's getting worse.
Yeah, no. Well, mine are too, because I'm jumping in on this, as you'll have seen in the last few months. So I've got one here. So I thought of, in the month of February, will disease be the enemy and greens treatment be necessary, or will they be proceeding steadily and maintaining good turf integrity?
They're getting worse and they're getting longer, Henry.
They really are. That was awful, wasn't it?
It was. It's not as easy as you think, is it?
Well, no, you make it look so easy, Glenn. I think I'm bowing out at that stage. But anyway, Glenn, big news with this edition.
That's right. We are going on a road trip this month, Henry, on our journey to Harrogate. Whilst we might be talking about February, we are driving along, chatting agronomy on our way to BTME.
Yes, and I've been looking forward to this one, Glenn, mainly because you said you'd drive. So what car have you chosen for our journey from your house in Hampshire all the way up to Harrogate?
I've decided to go with a DeLorean, Henry. After a couple of months of time travel and parallel dimension exploring, I thought a DeLorean might be useful if we decided to visit alternative timelines on our journey, should we wish.
Very good, Glenn. But I don't think we're going on that particular route this month, Glenn.
No, we're not. And so I'm very keen to stay under 88 miles an hour, Henry.
But a good idea. But I did tell Ed about this, and with him being such a car nut, he told me that a DeLorean was actually a terrible car and that it would be unlikely to make the whole journey in one piece. And he also said that it was a dead giveaway that we have no idea about cars. So, Glenn, it's the perfect choice as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I got no idea about cars either. Dan despairs of me, but I am a big 80s nostalgia fan. So there you go. And you, of course, Henry, are in charge of refreshments and music, aren't you? Although I do think this thing has only got a cassette deck.
Yes, well, I've got my flask and I've got my silver travel teapot, my knitted tea cosy, my china mugs plus spares just in case, a tea caddy containing the special blend, Glenn, a tea strainer, fine mesh for me, antique ceremonial tea tray, as well as my tea drinking jacket, deerstalker hat and a cravat, of course. So we're all set.
Well, actually, if I'm honest, I'd rather just stop at the services on the way, Henry.
Yeah, I know. I was only joking anyway. I'm not actually a tea snob, Glenn. Any tea and as it comes is always good enough for me. But I have bought some biscuits for your sweet tooth, Glenn.
Brilliant.
Ginger nuts this time, I think.
Oh, that's a cracking dunker.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? A postmodern classic, Glenn. And as navigator, I have my AA route map on my lap with all our stops marked along the way.
I can't remember the last time I actually saw a proper map, Henry. I'm more of a sat-nav man myself.
Yeah, well, it's back to the 80s, Glenn, isn't it?
Indeed. Okay, so what's the route?
Well, it's a journey that I've done many times before, Glenn, so I don't actually need a map. But anyway, we'll be starting from Winchester and then travelling up the A34 to the M40, then up and around Birmingham on the M42, controversial choice of route there, up to the M1, then over along the M18 to join the A1, heading further north for the last section of the journey to Harrogate in wonderful Yorkshire, Glen.
Sounds good to me, and plenty of time to chew the fat.
Yes, let's get cracking. I mean, what could possibly go wrong, Glenn?
Nothing. Belt up, Henry.
Well, we haven't even started yet, Glenn. So, Glenn, if my calculations are correct, then we are now out of Hampshire, which is a shame, of course, and just passing Newbury, famous mainly, I think, for its race course. But more importantly, Glenn, where are you going to take us this month for our monthly trawl through the climatic data?
Well, Henry, each month I look back through our 13-year Syngenta data set and have a look at the odds of what the weather is likely to do and what is likely to come our way. It's not forecasting, Henry, it's just understanding what we've had in the past to help us get our heads in the right place.
Yeah, and each month you take us to different locations, don't you, across the UK and Ireland, to try and give us a balanced view of things.
I do, and since it's February, I thought we'd go to some romantic places this month. You a big Valentine's Day man yourself, Henry?
Well, Valentine's Day is our son Charles's birthday, actually, and so the spotlight tends to be on that. But of course, we always uphold the tradition of anonymous cards for each other, which is good.
Well, you could take your better half to one of these locations, Henry, one of these locations that we're going to visit this month, climatically. We're going to go to Queen Victoria's favourite spot, Osborne House, down on the Isle of Wight. Or you could go to Gretna Green, famous spot on the Scottish border for runaway weddings. Or the stunning Galway Bay on the west coast of Ireland, famous for provoking your greatest ever hangover, Henry. A story I'm looking forward to hearing. And Portmeirion, of course, in Wales, the home of flowery pottery, a Valentine's staple in our house that my sister would buy for my mum on my dad's behalf and then insist Dad gave her the cost of goods plus a hefty management fee, right until she was in her late 20s. She was happy, Dad was happy, Mum was happy.
Brilliant. Capitalism at work, Glenn. It keeps the wheels turning, doesn't it? So we have the Scottish border with Cumbria for Gretna Green, the very centre of the south coast of England with the Isle of Wight, North Wales and Galway Bay in Ireland. So that will be interesting as they all kind of face the weather coming from the west, don't they? So shall we start with the moisture balance, Glenn?
Yes, let's do that. And this month we continue with the theme we saw in January, that theme of lowish evapotranspiration rates. All four locations have increased a tiny little bit now, ticking along at kind of 25 to 30 millimetres of moisture loss a month. Best case scenario in February is kind of 1 millimetres of evapotranspiration a day.
Okay, but of course we need to compare those figures with the rainfall to get the actual balance of moisture.
That's right, and rainfall now in February is pretty variable. All of these locations have seen some dry Februaries, less so in Portmeirion in Wales. They have only seen 1 year with less than 40 millimetres in the last 13 years. But Galway and East Cowes on the Isle of Wight have both seen 2 years with less than 35 millimetres of rainfall, and Gretna has seen 4 Februaries with less than 30 mil in the last 13 years.
Okay, so some potential there for February to be, well, what, a break-even month at least?
Maybe, and since we're seeing more and more extremes, what I thought I'd do this month is work out what an extreme scenario could look like for moisture in these locations.
Well, the extremes are the new norm, aren't they, Glenn?
Yeah, they are. So what I've done here is I've used the least rainfall and deducted the most amount of evapotranspiration in the driest extreme. And then for the wettest, I've taken the wettest year and deducted the least amount of evapotranspiration.
Okay, I think I'm with you.
Good. Well, bear with me for a little bit and it will come clear, Henry. So if we go down to the Isle of Wight, the driest they could experience based on recent records is 20 millimetres drier at the end of the month than when they started. The wettest year that they could see based on recent records, is 139 millimetres wetter at the end of the month than when they started. But their average is right around 41 millimetres wetter at the end of the month than when they started.
Okay, so I think you'd work on the basis that they're most likely to come out of February wetter, Glenn.
Yes, slightly, but maybe 40 mil. Not massive, but wetter slightly. So if we go up to Gretna, the driest year they are likely to experience in a real extreme situation based on historic records is about an 8 millimetres deficit. So a little bit drier coming out from when they went in. The wettest scenario based on recent records, 105 millimetres wetter at the end of the month. And an average for them looks like 29 millimetres wetter in February.
Okay, so I think they're unlikely to be drying down at this time.
Yeah, I think you're right. Now, if we go to Galway, over on the west coast of Ireland, a dry extreme for them would be about break even. In fact, it's about 3 millimetres drier. The wettest year they're likely to experience, if an extreme kicks in, is about 185 millimetres wetter. But an average year for them is about 71 millimetres wetter at the end of February from when they started.
Well, knowing what I know, I think it would be a miracle if Galway saw a drying February. But, fingers crossed for those guys.
Yeah, indeed. These extremes do happen. And Portmeirion in Wales, driest year they're likely to experience in an extreme, based on historic recent records, 12 millimetres drier. A wet year for them, though, 344 millimetres wetter, Henry, which is painful, but their average years 126 millimetres wetter at the end of February from when they started.
Well, it's not actually funny anymore, is it?
No,
I mean, so for West Wales, for Wales, indeed, it could be biblical again. They really don't get any breaks, do they, over there, especially at this time of year?
No, it doesn't look like it to me, Henry.
Okay, but February does look to be getting more borderline in some areas than in recent months, but only very occasionally actually in the territory of drying out.
Now, we can get some drier Februaries, though, about 1 in 4 down in the drier areas and about 1 in 13 in wet areas. So possibly a good time to really think about wetting agent applications, as once we go into March, those soil moisture deficits have potential to start moving in a drying direction. So February is probably the last guaranteed month for some locations of a wetting soil, which is what we're looking for those early wetting agent applications.
And that's quite common now, isn't it, especially for dry sites at this time. Right, so moving on, what about the temperatures? You told us last month that the first 2 weeks of February are generally the coldest weeks of the year, but what range of temperatures might we expect to see at this time?
Well, max temperatures for February are coming in at about 16 degrees, but that's pretty unusual. Most years, these locations are only getting up to about 12 degrees.
That's interesting. So what about the coldest?
Well, that can be tough now. All locations that we're looking at here have reached around -7.5 in February, except the Isle of Wight, which has only reached -4. And unlike the heat extremes, these -3s and -4s are pretty consistent in February.
Okay, so looking beyond the extremes, what do the averages look like?
Okay, average temperatures, which are a far better representation of what really goes on, are sitting around 9 degrees during the day for both the Isle of Wight and for Galway. And Gretna and Portmeirion are sitting at about 7.5 degrees daytime average temperature. So that hasn't moved loads from the January numbers, which were right around 7 to 8 degrees during the day. If we look at overnight temperatures, they're down at about 3 degrees on average for the Isle of Wight, Galway and Portmeirion. But if we go up to Gretna, that is about 1.25, 1.25 degrees up there on the English-Scottish border.
Okay, so obviously wintry conditions really, not great during the day, but we can get some nice ones occasionally, and cold overnight. The same as January really, as you were saying, and I think the thing is that those overnight temperatures can stay fixed in those areas, can't they, for a while yet, which I suppose in some ways might be a good thing.
Yes, I think so. Daytime temperatures do start to lift during the spring months, but those overnight temperatures tend to stay low. So we have potential to start to sneak in some better daytime temperatures, particularly towards the end of the month, but generally still pretty cold, particularly overnight. So not too dissimilar to January. We've just got to wait till March for things to start moving on the temperature and the evapotranspiration front.
Oh, well, that's not too far away. So, might we start seeing some of those waves of growth that we talked about last year starting to roll in February?
Well, they're more likely than I thought, Henry. We start to see them rolling in, but more of that in part 2.
Okay, so what do the February conditions look like from a disease management point of view? How is that balance of temperatures and leaf wetness looking?
So here we're looking at how long is the leaf wet for. Those wet leaf hours give disease an opportunity to move and infect its neighbours. So a wet leaf is a driver of disease, particularly microdochium patch disease. And the other thing we're going to look at is sub 2 degree hours, which is a stopper of disease. These cold hours do a lot of the heavy lifting now to slow down the development of that microdochium patch disease.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think of February as being a month of particularly high disease pressure, Glenn. I'm expecting our sub 2 degree stopping hours to be on the increase, and the leaf wetness to be declining in the colder conditions. So I'm hoping that things will be sort of getting better really in terms of disease pressure. The January figures last month, they were quite scary, weren't they, with over 16 hours a day of leaf wetness, coupled with about only 3 hours a day of our sub 2 degree stopping hours. So what does February look like in reality, Glenn?
So leaf wetness hours average per day for Gretna green is now averaging at about 9.25 hours a day of leaf wetness, and sub 2 degree hours are up to 5.5 hours of sitting below that 2 degrees.
Okay, well that feels like a big step forward from previous months. But what level of disease pressure do we think these figures would create? You know, I think that I'd be feeling a bit more comfortable about disease pressure with this combination.
I think you're right. I think it'll be lower disease pressure here than we've seen running up to this period, and I think about 1 in 6 years, if we look at the odds, we'll see high leaf wetness and, you know, warm enough year for temperatures to drive some serious disease. So about 1 in 6, I think, might be a difficult one in this location.
Okay, so still a chance of conditions that are favourable for higher levels of disease pressure, but on the other side of the coin, I suppose, 5 years out of 6, we should be experiencing relatively low background disease pressure. Okay, so what about Galway?
Okay, so in Galway, we're seeing about 9.5 hours of leaf wetness on average, and about 2 hours, 45 minutes of sub 2 degree hours.
So I presume that the leaf wetness in this area has also dropped since January, and those sub 2 degree stopping hours might be around the same, meaning a slight lowering of disease pressure, which would be good news. But of course those guys will still very much be on guard.
Indeed, but these are averages, remember, and we do see some variability. But so it's more often we're going to see that disease pressure here. I'd say in Galway, about 1 in 3 years we move into the kind of danger area for leaf wetness, and maybe every other year the temperatures are high enough for some disease pressure.
So we're saying that Galway in February will experience some low-level microdochium patch disease pressure, but 2 out of 3 it will be more significant. And of course, in reality, the conditions might swing around from week to week.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so let's go down to the Isle of Wight and to East Cowes, where Osborne House is. And there we see an average of 8.75 hours of leaf wetness a day and about 3.25 hours of stopping hours.
Okay, so if that was playing out, I think we might see a lowish level of microdochium patch disease pressure, but how often does that play out?
Okay, so down in the south, down on the south coast, about 1 in 3 can deliver dangerously high leaf wetness years, and 1 in 6, I think, will deliver higher pressure from those low sub 2 degree hours.
Okay, so maybe 1 in 3 or 4 Februaries might be really tough down there in terms of microdochian patch disease pressure.
Yeah, I think so. And lastly, Port Merion.
Yeah, Wales, they've been really having a tough time of it for the last few months. So how are they doing, up there on the west coast?
Okay, so in Port Merion, they're sitting at about 10 3/4 hours of leaf moisture a day, with an average of 3 1/4 hours a day of sub 2 degree hours. And the odds of a dangerously wet leaf here is about 1 in 3, and temperature-wise, I'd say it's about every other year, 1 in 2, they move into dangerously high temperatures.
Gosh, they really don't get a break, do they? So once again in Wales, even in February, it looks like it's the toughest place in the UK and Ireland to be managing disease pressure. Interesting stuff, Glenn. So in general, because we can't make a direct comparisons with last month's locations, since January, the leaf wetness looks to be dropping, and the sub 2 degree hours, stopping hours, are slightly increasing, but they're certainly staying relatively high.
Yeah, that's right. Those microdochian patch conditions should be easing in February, and the disease pressure either dropping or staying low. Now that makes things fairly easy to manage if you've come into this period pretty clean, but maybe more challenging for you if you're taking some serious disease scars into this period. Those who are stuck in the agronomic losers section we spoke about last month, if you're there, these mildest periods can just kickstart some activity. But you're also waiting for that milder weather that could start coming our way to start aiding recovery too. It can be a bit of a struggle, but it's not super simple in the agronomic winners dimension either. They've got to keep an eye on things too, because we still do get occasional times where we're going to be mild and damp, and that can elevate that risk of attack.
Yeah, so we clearly still needs to be keeping an eye on things, but in general, this is not a particularly high risk time for microdochian patch disease, but we can't be complacent, and we will need to keep an eye out for those milder temperatures and that leaf wetness to properly gauge the situation for our own site.
Indeed, and February it can be quite a nice time, particularly if we're in really good shape going into it, but it can be frustratingly long as well if we do need to initiate some early recovery.
Yeah, it could be a long 28 days, Glenn.
I enjoyed that, Henry. The weather data is always particularly interesting.
Concentrate on the road, Glenn. So, if my calculations are correct, we want to take this junction, Glenn, for the M40 northbound.
Thanks, Henry. Could you do a sat-nav voice for me?
No, Glenn. Anyway, we've got the Cherwell Valley services coming up. Shall we take a comfort break, have a cuppa, and stretch our legs?
It's a good idea, Henry, although I thought you'd bought your own tea.
It's all right, Glenn. They have decent tea and coffee for you at the motorway services these days. It's not like the 1980s. I think I might go for an English breakfast tea with unsweetened soya milk. What do you tend to go for?
Latte and a donut on the side, Henry. You've got to keep those energy levels up.
Okay, Glenn, so we have run the gauntlet of the service station toilets, which was fairly traumatic as always. We've grabbed a brew and are now back on the road. And in the end, I went for a peppermint tea, Glenn.
Oh, lovely. Did you go for it for its calmative effects, Henry?
I just like the taste, Glenn, but anything's a bonus, especially if you're in a car. How's your coffee?
Lovely, Henry. It'll keep me going for a while.
Well, I've actually scheduled another stop for Warwick services, Glenn, in about half an hour. I'm a bit older than you see.
Yeah, that's probably wise, Henry. And after all, there's no rush, is there?
So, before we get there, what about the level of expectation in February, Glenn? Are we still dealing with that unmeetable level of expectation from the golfers?
Yeah, probably to a certain degree. It's the coldest point of the year now, Henry. Growth is non-existent.
So, for the course manager, it's probably a time of patience and protecting what we've managed to keep until now. We mentioned last month the importance of roping off and general course protection measures. Is there anything that we need to add to that?
Not really. Same as last month, to be honest. Let's keep focused on moving holes regularly, moving ropes, using rubber mats at the end of paths. Really thinking about greenkeeper traffic routes, moving tee markers regularly, adopting some AstroTurf on appropriate weaker tees. Keep up the really strong communication with the membership, educating them in the benefits of carrying bags rather than using their trolleys. There's loads we can do now to protect the course. Just got to keep talking to the club and keep showing them how much you care. You know, in two things. We've got to show them we care about the golfer and that we care about protecting the golf course. If we frame it like that, most people will understand where we're coming from.
Yes, very good. Simple stuff. And of course, with little or no growth going on, there might be the opportunity, maybe, to get the team together and do some training. I know our guys are always happy to get involved with the technical side of things.
Yeah, it's a good idea, and even a bit of team building just to keep team spirits up at this colder time of the year. It won't be long until some sun arrives and we can all feel a little heat on our backs.
Yeah, and hopefully those spring growth waves will start rolling in soon enough.
Yeah, let's chat about those when we're on the M1, Henry.
Good idea. Anyway, next stop, Warwick Services, Glenn. It might be a long way to Harrogate if I have any more tea.
No problem, Henry, but I might grab myself another coffee.
Back on the move again, Glenn, and coming up to Birmingham soon, and I have a real affinity for Birmingham after doing the Commonwealth Games last year. It was really great. Anyway, I want you to merge onto the M42 and head for the M1 North, Glenn.
Honestly, Henry, it would just be easier if you put the route up on my phone.
But I have something much better than that, Glenn.
What have you got that's better than a route finder on a phone?
Sat finger, Glenn. You need to go that way.
You're pointing, Henry.
Yeah, now you're getting it, Glenn. Just follow the finger.
Oh, God, I thought this thing was just completely pointless.
Very good, Glenn.
So, Henry, what are the agronomic risks that might be heading our way in February?
Well, Glenn, the agronomic risks aren't generally at a peak in February, but they certainly are there. And as always, they can create a real mess if we underestimate or ignore them.
Okay, so what's the top of the list then?
Well, probably straightforward wear and tear, Glenn. February is the lowest ebb in terms of temperatures, light levels and growth. And the ground is likely to be either wet underfoot or frozen, and so the turf will certainly need some careful handling to protect it from deteriorating rapidly during this time.
Yes, especially in situations where that pressure is being amplified by shading and poor drainage.
Yeah.
I think traffic management does remain our number one priority at this time of year.
Yeah, me too. And also, it wouldn't be unusual to see some anthracnose basal rot disease in the greens at this time, especially if the turf is struggling as a result of some cultural or environmental factors. You know, taking your eye off the ball nutritionally, for instance, on the run up to this period can have its consequences in that area. There's always an agronomic balance to be struck, isn't there? Weak turf, actually, or even overly inflated turf might highlight the need for slight adjustments in future programs.
Yeah, we just can't take our eye off the ball, can we? If we've got some anthracnose floating around now, it's definitely something we need to watch and monitor.
Yeah.
And we could go to something like Medallion or even Instrata Elite, but that would only be needed if we felt there was a real danger of things starting to get out of control.
And they might be part of our thinking for microdocium patch disease control also. But hopefully we won't need them with the disease pressure tailing off a touch, as we've just been talking about. We will always need to be more wary of those improperly or partially controlled outbreaks, because they might be in danger of flaring up again if conditions turned mild and damp.
Yes, that's right. We really need to keep a very close eye on those dormant scars during this time, especially if there's a dangerous snow cover.
Yeah. A persistent snow cover on unfrozen ground might be a real danger, and something that we will constantly need to be aware of at this time, and maybe even need a prior treatment of the greens with fungicides if the forecast looks like it's conspiring against you.
So what about trying to initiate some growth in February to help us recover from some of this scarring?
Yeah, the end of battles 1 and 2. Well, obviously this is going to depend on your ongoing conditions, but some locations might start showing some early and slow signs of movement at this time, and you're going to talk about that a little bit later, aren't you?
I am.
But it would only be a very subtle and probably only in quite exceptional circumstances, maybe, probably more likely towards the end of the month. But if some growth opportunities did start to emerge, which is becoming more and more common, then we might be thinking of applying a dressing of something like Green Master Pro Light Invigorator 408 plus FE, or Invigorator Plus 4014 plus FE at around 25 to 30 grams per metre squared to deliver 10 to 12 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare as sulfate of ammonia over the following 4 to 6 weeks, ready for when those waves of early spring growth might start rolling in earnest. Granulars are a good way of being ready to take advantage of those growth opportunities, but you'd only do it based on a reasonable forecast and some past experience of the site during this period. It would certainly be an on the horizon move, but we know from our trials and extensive user experience that this kind of application can bring real benefits through February and March.
But not cold start at this time of year? Not quite yet, Henry?
I don't think so at this stage, Glenn. It just feels a bit too early to be applying 25 to 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare at this early stage, when the growth opportunities might still be too few and far between, unless of course you're in the very southwest maybe. We shouldn't be applying nutrition unnecessarily, or when we don't think that it'll be fully utilized. I think the cold start, the 1155 plus iron, will be better applied at a time when we feel that the growth waves are more likely to be rolling in more frequently or for longer, and so maybe later in March and into April most likely for that product.
Yeah, I think you're right. We do need to be very careful about how we allocate our nitrogen, particularly at this early stage of the year.
And of course we shouldn't forget that we might be wanting to generate some recovery to support some super early renovations that might be taking place in February. But in that case, I think we're actually accepting a lack of growth at this time, but using those waves of growth to generate recovery in the following weeks. But in this case, I still think it would be those low nitrogen, sulfate of ammonia based invigorators that we would lean on at this stage. But those super early renovations are becoming more and more common, and so we need to build around them properly. It's certainly great to get the work done and recovered before the Masters, but it does need to be done properly.
Yes, and taking into the account the level of disease risk for the weeks afterwards, I think is important. And it just amazes me that the Masters is already on the horizon for golf courses in the UK and Ireland.
Yeah. It's such a great event, isn't it? But I'm sure that it influences greenkeeping across the globe around this time, months in ahead, more than any other event on the sort of calendar. Anyway, those early top dressings might well heighten the risk of some microdocium patch disease activity, and so depending on conditions might mean us considering a proactive fungicide application to prevent disease from flaring up around those renovations.
That's right, we always need to be looking forward. And so, Henry, it kind of occurs to me that nutrition inputs for the year might well start in February, and so this is a good time, I think, to start thinking about how we might approach our nutrition planning for the whole year.
Yeah, that's right. And it certainly is, Glenn, I would say.
And you're going to touch on that in the second part, aren't you?
Yes, I am, because we should have a plan in place for the year, shouldn't we? And an idea of our target figures. And so I'll run through what the ICL thinking is on that particular subject.
Good. And I'm sure that being a fertiliser company, you are occasionally treated with a certain amount of scepticism when it comes to these programmes.
Yeah, we are. But I think only from people who haven't been involved in the process. Our team are not interested in recommending unnecessary or over-egged programs. They only tend to leave you with egg on your face, Glenn.
Yeah, I see what you did there.
Thanks, Glenn. But we just want to optimise our inputs and deliver agronomically concise turf responses depending on the individual needs of each situation.
Great, and so we're going to look forward to that one. Is there anything else to think about in February? Frosty conditions are usually a bone of contention at this time of year.
Yes, they are, and you got a bit of that off your chest last month, didn't you? And how is the puppy, by the way?
Yeah, doing very well. Settling down, sleeping through the night, and only peeing indoors when it's too cold to go out.
Well, that's good news, Glenn. So in terms of frosty ground conditions, we've spoken before about needing to be mindful not to let the course sustain too much damage at this time by continuing to play when ground conditions aren't suitable. And although play in frosty conditions might not always result in too much direct damage to the greens, there might be wider damage across the course to be thinking about, especially when the frost starts coming out of the ground.
Yeah, of course, and we've got those health and safety risks to think about, those risks associated with slippery ground and falling ground and all of those things going on.
Exactly. So, a great deal of care is needed in those conditions. But unless we get another beast from the east during February, then it shouldn't cause too many issues as long as we are free to manage things sensibly.
Which isn't always easy, is it, on a lovely, crisp and sunny February morning?
No, and so we need to agree the policy beforehand, don't we? Hopefully there will be a reasonable compromise available with a little bit of give and take here and there.
Yes, it is. It's a difficult situation to manage, and I always revert back, as always, to communication being the key here and making sure that as many people as possible understand the situation and the potential consequences of playing on those frozen or thawing ground conditions. Get the majority of people on board, and they'll support you when the occasional disgruntled member pops up.
Indeed. And so quickly moving on, Glenn, the lack or extremely low levels of grass growth might also provide an opportunity for moss to encroach. A touch of nutrition and iron, such as in the invigorators, might help, but we should only be applying fertilizers if conditions are appropriate for a turf response. Alternatively, an application of soluble sulfate of iron, 15 to 20 kilograms per hectare, will knock its progress until turf growth resumes. And it may well be that these treatments are already being employed as part of the wider ITM strategy. Certainly, the water-soluble iron is a cost-effective option if treatment of the wider course is needed, which it can be in certain settings at this time of year, maybe impoverished heathlands or links or moorland settings in particular.
That's right, we might well be able to get around those wider areas now with the sprayer, but for some courses ground conditions might still make that a bit tricky, either soft wet ground or dangerously slippery slopes, or worm casting can still be an issue. In fact, sometimes we really need those cold temperatures to kind of calm down that pest activity as well, don't we?
Yeah, we do, yeah. So what about pest activity, Glenn? Are we likely to be seeing the early signs of damage from leather jacket infestations, either primary or secondary? Or are we still focusing on monitoring with our localised small-scale sheeting to give us an idea of what might be lurking underground?
Yes, we're still mainly monitoring still to see if soil temperatures are above 5 degrees. And if they are, pest activity is occurring, most likely on the south coast and particularly southwest, then some larger scale sheeting might be in the game for some sites. Still haven't completely got my head around just how effective or long lasting this method is, or even how practical it is, particularly now we've got golfers out there. But I do understand why people are doing it. This is something I want to do some more work on, or at least get some more feedback on, just to understand how it fits into a wider integrated turf management approach, which is something that I have been focusing on my mind on quite a bit in the last 12 months, Henry. But in answer to your question, I don't think that in an average February we'll be seeing much damage, but a mild one might start to see things kicking off a little earlier, just a bit sooner. We may start to see things in March, though.
Yes, okay, yeah. So, moving on again. Gosh, there's so much to talk about, isn't there, this month? Another thing that has become increasingly common practice on sites that are prone to drying out, as you mentioned earlier, is the application of surfactants or wetting agents. It wouldn't be the norm for everyone, but some sites, based on sandy soils or in drier parts of the country, have found out through experience that they really do need to get in front of the game at this time of year with their moisture management strategies, because February and then March in particular can be a drying time. So the aim is to use the early application of surfactant technology to ensure that the soil is fully charged at this time and conditioned to conserve moisture during an early season dry down process to help maintain turf quality and consistency. So although in February it might only be those courses that have struggled in the past or who are experiencing extreme circumstances that go out applying wetting agent. But in reality, many more courses will be thinking about their first surfactant applications in March. And so this is certainly on the horizon for many course managers. From ICL, Trismart is our go-to surfactant at 10 litres per hectare, but Aquasmart at 5 to 10 litres per hectare is also a good performer for those unirrigated situations that are prone to drying out. And of course we have Quilibra from Syngenta, don't we, Glenn, which is a premium brand and a proven performer in such situations. So what's the latest advice on Quilibra, Glenn? I know you've been focusing quite a lot of effort on that as well in recent times.
Yeah, we've been doing some trials recently and it always comes out well in those trials. And our advice is to start early where you can, just to get in front of that game, keep things on the damper side, as you said. For greens, the application rate is 20 litres a hectare, and at monthly intervals, it really is one of the benchmark products in this area on those green surfaces. For fairways, you can reduce those application rates slightly, 20 litres to start with, then 15 litres a hectare through the season. And it offers tremendous value for money for a premium product on wider areas if you kind of bulk buy in those big 500 litre IBCs. It offers some really good value on fairways, particularly at those 15 litre rates. And some of the trial data I've looked at would support even lower rates of kind of 15 litre starting if you start really early, just to get things under control. And then you can kind of tick it along through the wetter months at 10 litres, and when we reach the drier months, flex those rates a little bit. It's a great tank mix partner as well, things like Ryder and High Cure and even Primo in the right situation. But they're not really tank mixes for this time of year unless you've got a very specific challenge that you are targeting.
Okay, very good. So to conclude, before we stop for another comfort break, Glenn.
And a coffee and a donut.
Indeed. So although February might be the depths of winter, it is also something of a turning point, isn't it? And we need to be looking ahead because things will slowly start to take an upward turn. At this time we need to take the chances that might come our way and be on the lookout for any emerging extremes, mild, cold, wet or dry, and then react accordingly. If we can get through February in good agronomic shape, then we might begin to see those first signs of an upturn in March.
Or a backward step, Henry. Don't forget that, because March might well see conditions worsening, making those small February opportunities even more important.
Yeah, good point, Glenn, because, the road to spring tends to have lots of bumps along the way.
But during March, we should see waves of growth and kind of growing conditions begin to increase. But they will still be weak and short-lived. And so we are definitely in preservation mode for the time being. It's more important now not to go backwards than it is to push forward.
Okay, so keep hanging on in there, everyone, and certainly keep that weather eye on the horizon. Are we nearly there yet, Glenn?
Just around the next corner, Henry.
Are we nearly there now, Glenn?
Are you bored, Henry?
Yes, I am, Glenn.
Look, we're on the M1 now, Henry, and nearly in South Yorkshire, so it's not too far to go.
Oh,
Anyway, did you finish the Greenkeeper International puzzle page?
No, Glenn, I got stuck on the crossword, actually.
Oh, go on then. Let's see if I can help. I do love a crossword, and it'll help kill some time.
Yeah, okay. Right, good idea. Okay, so let me look. Right, we've got 3 clues to go. Okay, first one, 5 across. The clue is a highly successful and influential individual who has worked with the Muppets. 2 words, 5 and then 9.
Highly successful, work with Muppets. Got any letters?
Yeah, we've got an H, and then something something, and then RY, and then we've got BE, something something something, something 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 something.
Harry. God, that's a tricky one, Henry.
Yeah, no. A highly successful and influential individual who has worked with the Muppets.
Successful Muppets, Henry. I think I've got it. Yeah, I've got it.
Have you? That was quick.
Well, it's obvious if you think about it.
Is it?
Yeah, it's Harry Belafonte, the famous singer.
Is it?
Yeah, I think so. Does it fit? I saw a documentary about him once. He was a really interesting character. Stood up for his beliefs, made something of his life. True inspiration.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and he famously appeared on The Muppet Show. I'm a big Muppet fan, Henry.
Right, of course, right. Yeah, it fits. Well done. You really are good at crosswords, aren't you, Glenn?
I don't know about that, but I enjoy them. Come on, what else are you struggling with? Let's have a look.
Right, okay. So, right, 2 down then. The clue is a person of great benefit who is often and wrongly undervalued.
Interesting. Person of great benefit.
Yeah.
Could be like a doctor or a nurse, something like that. Wrongly undervalued. What letters you got?
Right, so I've got G something E something N, and then I've got K something 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 something.
G-E...
Yeah.
God, that's a tricky one as well. I'm struggling with that one.
It is. Yeah. Well, I think I know it, Glenn, and I think you might know it too, Mr. Kirby.
Of course, it seems so obvious now.
Have you got it?
Yeah. It's Greenkeeper, a person of great benefit who is often and wrongly undervalued. It's got to be Greenkeeper.
Yeah, of course. Do you know, I've never been any good at crosswords, Glenn. My dad is, but I think it misses a generation. Anyway, last one, Glenn. And then we've done it. And I can send it off to enter the prize draw.
The prize draw? That sounds cool. What's the first prize, Henry?
Well, I think you get to appear in the calendar, Glenn, in the background somewhere.
Ooh, sounds good. What's the clue?
Watchful idiom, Glenn.
Idiot, Henry.
No, idiom, Glenn. An idiom being a phrase that, taken literally, would either make no sense at all or have an entirely different meaning from the idiomatic definition.
Oh, that's very helpful, Henry. But I think I preferred idiot. Have you got any letters?
Yes, it's 3 words. It's O something, then it's T something E, and then it's something O, something 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 something.
It sounds like it's kind of on the something, Henry.
Oh, yes. But what could it be, Glenn? On the verge?
Are you?
On the right lines?
I don't think so, Henry.
On the ball?
Rarely, Henry.
On the fence, maybe?
Usually, Henry.
On the rocks?
It's starting to feel that way. On the lash?
No, I've given up. I mentioned that earlier. What are your plans?
Not me. I'm too old for all that lark. Although I'm sure I'll enjoy a drink with some old friends. On the lookout, Henry?
Not really, Glenn. I'm just trying to get this clue done.
No, Henry. I think the answer is on the lookout.
Oh, of course it is. And we really should have seen that one coming, shouldn't we, Glenn?
We're nearly there yet, Henry.
Just round the next corner. So, Glenn, just passing workshop now, look. What did you think of the Estonian entrance to their Eurovision 2023 qualifying competition?
Do you know what, Henry? There was some good stuff in there.
Yeah, it's a very high calibre this year, Glenn.
Well, I didn't know Eurovision fever started so early.
Yeah, it's brilliant, Glenn. There are about 30 qualifying competitions around Europe from now until the end of April. So absolutely no time to get bored. I've got a few playlists lined up if you're interested.
I think we need to crack on with part 2, actually, Henry, where I'm going to do spring waves and our application tip of the month. And I think you're talking about nutritional planning.
Yeah, no more tea breaks, Glenn, or we will never get there. So, Glenn, last year we introduced the concept of the spring growth waves to help us get a better understanding of how to handle the run-up to spring.
Yeah, that's right. It came out of our investigation into false springs, didn't it? That old agronomic phase that was meant to keep us all patient whilst we waited for spring and summer to arrive.
Yeah, and you had a pretty in-depth look at this, didn't you? And the reality was quite interesting, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And once again, I've had a little dig around the kind of spring temperatures to highlight just what we can expect and to help us learn how to maximise these waves of good weather that we can get from this point now in February until we kind of reach consistently good growing temperatures later in the year. And I'm careful here not to say growing weather, because whilst the temperatures may be there, there's no saying that the moisture levels will be there when they do arrive.
Yeah, but it's just a way of getting our heads around what to look out for, really, isn't it, when we're trying to generate early recovery? Because our chances in the next few weeks and months will only be short-lived waves of opportunity, and so we need to be ready if we want to make use of them, because this is all part of our Battle 3 strategy, isn't it?
Yes, it is. We're now in the third battle, and we're looking for growth opportunities to recover surfaces if we've struggled to this point. Or we'll be looking to utilise those same good weather breaks to make sure that the grass plant is as healthy as possible going into the season. It's a period where we can grab the opportunities if we are prepared. Okay, so last year what I did was I came up with a metric to measure these growth waves in the spring, these periods of weather that are conducive to growth but then disappear on us, like weather waves that may be heading our way. I wanted to understand and communicate with people just how many waves we get, when they start, and when do we move into consistent temperatures where Mother Nature truly releases the handbrake.
Very good. So what are we talking about then?
Well, we developed a fairly simple system. We were talking about phase 1 waves to start with, and this is the onset of some sort of growth. When can we realistically expect to see something, some kind of temperatures that allow some growth? And what I'm looking for here is the first period of the year where we see a rolling 7-day average of 5 degrees and above.
Okay, so phase 1 waves are when growth starts to slowly emerge.
That's right. Now, phase 2 waves are when we consistently reach a rolling 7-day average of 10 degrees. To my mind, that's when the temperatures are conducive to consistent growth. And then what I wanted to understand was how many waves of growth do we get between those two dates?
And it is interesting to see retrospectively how many of these waves or potential opportunities for growth actually occur before more consistent growth is established in the spring. And armed with this understanding, we can schedule our spring nutrition properly.
Indeed, that's right.
So, Glenn, when do the phase 1 waves tend to start, and how long do they go on for?
Well, I'm going to look at 2 locations here, Henry. Osborne in East Cowes down on the Isle of Wight to represent the south, and Gretna Green on the Scottish-England border. Just to try and understand and get an idea of what things look like across the UK.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So what do they look like?
Well, let's work backwards, as 2022 should be the most recent in your mind, Henry. And we'll start with East Cowes on the Isle of Wight. In 2022, phase 1 started on the 11th of January, but consistent growth, phase 2, wasn't until the 24th of May. So that was 133 days, Henry.
Okay, well, that's a long time of like stop-start, isn't it? Just like this journey, Glenn. But an incredibly early start, actually. How does that compare to 2021 then?
Well, in 2021, phase 1 started on the 1st of January until the 15th of May. So that was 134 days.
Okay, well, that's remarkably similar, isn't it? Like 4.5 months of intermittent growth.
In fact, as this is a calendar year I'm working from, Henry, I suspect this far south we never really come out of this inconsistent growth pattern all winter. So whilst 130 days sounds horrible, it's actually gone on much longer than that, maybe since November.
Yeah. Okay, so let's have a look further north at Gretna Green. I would think that that's going to be a shorter period of intermittent growth.
Okay, let's have a look. Gretna Green in 2022, that started phase 1, 17th of February, and phase 2 kicked in on the 26th of May. So that was a 98-day period. And if we go back another year, 2021, that phase 1 started on the 9th of March and phase 2 kicked in on the 18th of May. So that was 70 days last year.
Okay, so it starts later, doesn't it? So this, and I suppose we should say transitional period, further north is shorter, isn't it? Around 70 days, whereas further south it started earlier and it goes on for longer, doesn't it? 130 days.
Yep, that's right. I've run a few years through my master computer and it looks like the Isle of Wight averages at 4.25 months of the year and Gretna Green just over 3 months of the year. Let's call it a third to a quarter of the year, Henry, when growth is starting and stopping and it just doesn't really know where it is.
Well, I think it's called the rocky road to spring, Glenn.
Indeed, but it's always frustrated me that we have to wait until spring is over to get on with things. I think we have opportunities to get going in this period. These can be opportunities to move things forward from a plant health point of view, if you're in the agronomics winners dimension, as we spoke about last month, or it's a time to commence some recovery if you're in the agronomic losers dimension we spoke about last month. Because between these two dates, we get waves. We get waves of good temperatures that enable us to get started. Little peaks and troughs where we dip in and out of growth, or at least at temperature conducive to growth.
So how many of those phase 1 waves do we see on average each year, Glenn?
Well, let's go back through the last 4 years. 2022, on the Isle of Wight, they saw 6. 2021, they saw 6. Wow. 2020, they saw 2 waves of growth. And in 2019, they saw 5 waves of growth.
So that's quite a few, isn't it? And what about Gretna Green?
Okay, 2022, they saw 4, albeit smaller and shorter than down south. 2021, they saw 3. 2020, they saw 3, but they were big ones in 2020. And then 2019, they saw 4.
So even further north, there's a few opportunities there, isn't there? You know, I mean, I do my trial work in Yorkshire, so not as far north as Gretna, but not far off. And when I talk about my spring fertiliser trials, I sort of always recount the weather during them. And I think there are at least 3 occasions when I swap from saying, and then spring arrived, and then go back to, and then winter returned again. It is a really frustrating time, isn't it? And I think in all my trials, the cruelest return to wintry conditions was at the end of May one year. Generally, I would say the greenkeeping fraternity are completely frazzled by the time summer finally gets here, especially further north. So Glenn, looking at the data, how long do these waves tend to last for?
Well, they're variable and wavy, Henry. They tend to roll in anything from a few days to a couple of weeks, but they get stronger and longer the closer you get to the end of May.
Right, okay, and how do we spot them, looming on that horizon?
Well, I think we just watched the weather forecast, Henry. The biggest clue is in the overnight temperatures. When we see those overnight temperatures lift to 4 or 5 degrees, that is the key to starting to unlock those average temperatures. That is the key that we are, that key sign that we are in a positive growth wave.
Yes, it does govern things, doesn't it, the nighttime temperatures at this time of year. Very good, Glenn. And so what we think of as the emergence of spring is actually a period of time between when temperatures periodically become conducive to intermittent growth pulses or phase 1 waves, through to the arrival of conditions that are consistently conducive to growth, or phase 2. Generally, this transition can last anywhere between 3 and 4 months. Some years can have greater or more frequent waves than others, depending on, what the year throws at us.
That's right. Those peaks may be slightly higher and troughs may be slightly lower, but the growth waves do seem to be a countrywide phenomenon. Every one of these waves is an opportunity, isn't it, Henry? It's an opportunity to use that growth for recovery and preparation.
Yes, and we just need to be ready to use those upturns, especially if we need to get through to the end of battle 3 in good shape, and not get frustrated or surprised by the inevitable downturns.
That's right. They're all little opportunities to grab to help meet our own agronomic needs. But if I think back to what I learned or had installed in me as a young greenkeeper, it was I should just sit out these waves and wait till consistent growth arrived before we began to push the golf course forward. And that mindset was there. We just simply had to wait. And I think I always wrestled with that as a course manager. I think I felt a little bit naughty when I was utilising these waves. Or maybe I felt I was going to get caught out and something would just go wrong. And I don't think I ever fully embraced them or utilised them the way I should.
One last thing before we sort of move on, because we're talking about this a little bit earlier than we did last year. We're here in February, aren't we, talking about the spring waves. What do you think the chances are of getting some phase 1 waves this early? Do you think that we'll be in a position to grab one and use it now?
Probably, Henry. And I was a bit surprised by this when I dug into the numbers. Gretna Green has seen 2 of these waves in February in the last 4 years. 2020 was a really decent one, about 20 days of positive temperatures. Wow. And in 2022, they saw a quick 9-day event.
Wow. Well, that actually gives us some hope of a possibility at least. What about the Isle of Wight?
Well, the further south we go, the stronger they get. And in East Cowes, we've seen something every year. In 2019, it was a short 7-day burst, starting right around Valentine's Day. In 2020, it went from about the 5th of February, and spring started about then, and it didn't really look back from that day forward. And 2021, February was actually one big wave, and March experienced absolutely no growing conditions. So February turned out to be our opportunity that year. 2022, that was a really decent one, started about the 15th and ended up kind of going into early March with average temperatures at around 10 degrees. So again, February was better than March last year.
Okay, so it looks like there might be some opportunities for some small scale, shall we say, marginal recoveries in February. Yeah, which is, of course, would be really important if we lost battles 1 and 2 and we're looking to generate recovery. And I think the most important point is we shouldn't really overlook them, because we can get a downturn in conditions at any time, really, and we don't know how long they will last.
Yeah, we just need to be aware that the waves are now coming and they will be on us soon. So we just make the most of them.
Very good, Glenn. Okay, Satfinger is pointing you towards the M18 for the A1 North, Glenn.
Yep, I see it, and I'm following it, Henry.
Not far to go now, Glenn.
No, and with your thoughts on nutrition planning, I'm sure that the miles will quickly roll by.
Oh, thanks, Glenn.
So, Henry, with those waves of growth potentially starting to form, we might be starting to think about the application of some nutrition to optimise and amplify and maybe even extend those growth opportunities.
Absolutely, Glenn.
And so we thought that this would be a good time to discuss the annual nutritional inputs, because we want to keep our programmes in agronomic check, don't we?
Yes, we do, because we need to set our inputs at the right level to support our maintenance programme, but without overdoing it or underdoing it, because that's when the problems start. Our inputs always needs to be pitched correctly.
Ah, the Goldilocks zone, Henry. And that's right, because everything everywhere will be different in terms of site characteristics and also where they are agronomically and what they want to achieve. So we just can't employ an off-the-shelf prescriptive program. They all need to be tailored for each club.
They do indeed, Glenn, because there are so many factors that influence our nutritional inputs. It might be grass types, soil types, climatic conditions, growth patterns, the intensity of maintenance, maybe even agronomic aspirations.
Don't forget budgets and resources and people's capabilities.
Yeah, of course. And with all these factors being particular to each site, we really do need to take them into account and work through all those issues and requirements before we can build the programme.
And that's what your Super ICL team can help with, isn't it?
Yeah, they're a great bunch of technical agronomists who know the importance of this process and taking the time to figure out each situation and place the right technologies at the right time and rate to achieve the precise response that's required for the job at hand. You know, they will factor in all those things into their discussions and build around maintenance weeks and a fixture schedule, etc. You know, all that stuff that needs to be taken into account.
Okay, so how do they go about deciding on how much nitrogen to apply then?
Well, that will vary greatly depending on the situation. You know, with those quiet, fescue-dominated links courses having the lowest requirement and intensively managed annual meadowgrass dominant USGA root zone type greens probably being the highest. I think the spectrum, the reasonable spectrum, might be as wide as 40 to 160 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. It might even be wider depending on the situation, and each might reasonably be described as being best management practice for their own particular situations. But of course, if those inputs were swapped over and imposed on each other, it would be an absolute disaster. So it's all about setting the level of inputs to what is right for you.
And of course, we always have the problem of everything being calculated properly. You know, sometimes you hear of lawn sand being applied at a hefty rate for the sulfate of iron response, but the nitrogen at around 4% not being factored into the calculations. That could be upwards of 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in a single whack. Some top dressing materials as well can also contain a fair amount of nitrogen. It's a bit of a minefield really, but the important thing is that you understand what you're applying and calculate your own figures properly and be honest with yourself.
Of course. And our starting point when setting the nitrogen target for the year, I think, would be with the existing inputs and an evaluation of the agronomic responses that they created. Was it too much or too little growth, or was it badly phased to result in inappropriate or unwanted turf responses? And agronomic occurrences such as the development of anthracnose, microdochium patch disease, and things like moss encroachment can sometimes help us to pinpoint a need for adjustment in the nutritional program. But you would need to be careful with that to fully understand the driving forces behind these sort of agronomic occurrences, because it might be that other factors such as mowing intensity or shading or climatic factors might be at the root cause instead.
And of course, we might also want to make adjustments because we have a longer term agronomic transition in mind.
Absolutely, Glenn. And if we're talking about a sward species transformation and following the 4 different phases that we discussed when we talked about the disturbance theory in August, I think it was, then each of those transitional phases will require very different nutritional approaches to suit the different agronomic aims of each phase.
Okay, so let's say that we're in phase 2, where we have created a really good foundation of drainage, soil organic matter content, along with good light and airflow.
Yeah, so we've created an agronomic foundation here that we have the most control of, I think, and where we are better able to create an environment that will suit the development of, say, brown top ben or creeping bentgrass species. This will probably actually entail a reduction of the fertilizer inputs that were being used to get you here, but you would still need enough to sustain plant health and allow the production of decent surfaces during this stage of the transition. So at this stage, we will probably be renovating early in the spring and overseeding. And it would also involve the incorporation of maybe 60 to 80 tons of top dressing through this time, and then a less intensive renovation program later in the autumn, again involving the incorporation of some top dressing, but at a lower level, maybe 20 to 40 tons maybe. Overseeding would probably be taking place whenever appropriate. During the main playing season, we're trying not to be too aggressive with our surface preparations, and so we'll try to maintain a reasonable height of cut, be brushing rather than verticutting, and we'll be top dressing and turf ironing when needed to maintain firm, smooth and true putting surfaces. It's more complicated than that, but you get the picture.
Yeah, all fairly standard stuff. So how do we go about planning our nutrition though to support that program?
Yeah, well, in this example scenario, we can easily imagine the agronomic responses that we would need to create throughout the year to support this agronomic position. In January, February and early March, so maybe 10 weeks, our aim is primarily to prevent sward deterioration, and so some but minimal nutrition might be required to keep things going. Maybe 1 kilogram of nitrogen per hectare per week supplied using sulfate of ammonia. Simple stuff. Then during March, April and May, so maybe 12 weeks, we might see those phase 1 waves of growth starting to emerge and increase in frequency, duration and magnitude. The level of potential growth would depend on your location and conditions at the time. But this is a time, as we've been discussing, of an opportunity. And so we might be looking to establish some growth, if possible, to get through those early renovations and top dressing to set up the surfaces by the time of the masters. During this time, we might be looking to apply in the region of 4 kilograms of nitrogen per week, but for a 5 to 6 week period over a background level of maybe 2 kilograms of nitrogen per week, to get recovery through those dressings. So during this time, we might be applying 35 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare.
And well, now we're up to about 45 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in total, aren't we?
That's right. And we're just looking to get ourselves through to the end of May in good shape and ready for the arrival of more consistent and reliable growth levels.
Okay, so it feels like we're front-loading our nitrogen to get through those renovations and recovery.
Yeah, we are a bit, but nothing too heavy. In this example, we've got a job to do, don't we? But then during June, July, August and into September, so maybe 18 weeks, we would settle into our not too aggressive surface preparation routines, which would be supported by maybe 2 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per week on average. It might be slightly lower or possibly higher for a time, especially if there's a history of anthracnose or even dollar spot developing during July, for instance. But let's just say that we allocate another 40 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare through this time, phasing it according to the agronomic needs.
So we're now up to about 85 kilograms of nitrogen. And what about our autumn renovations?
Yeah, well, they will need an enhanced response for a short period to get through that top dressing. So maybe 3 to 4 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per week for 4 weeks, maybe, just to generate that recovery and support the seedling establishment as well if we're overseeding at that time. So maybe another 15 kilograms of nitrogen on top.
Okay, so that's taking us up to 100 so far.
Yes, well done. And then through November and December, which would be 8 weeks, we'll be at maybe 1 to 2 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per week, depending on conditions to maintain turf quality, generate some recovery and prevent deterioration. So maybe another 10 kilos of nitrogen through this period to see us through to the end of the year.
So in this example, we wind up at 110 kilograms of nitrogen for the year.
Yeah, all aiming to support the agronomic requirements of this second phase of sward species development. If you're in phase 1, then you might be applying more. If you are later on in the transition, you might be applying less. It just depends on the agronomics of the situation. And that's what we would need to discuss, of course.
Yes, and so I suppose every programme would be different.
Yeah, they should be bespoke to your individual needs. And the trick within each program is to choose the nitrogen sources, formulations and products that can produce the desired response for that allotted period. And this is what our team do, but only after they've discussed the situation and understand all the agronomic requirements properly, because it's a collaborative process really with the course managers, who have their own experiences and understandings of nutritional responses to draw from too. I know that our team absolutely love this part of their role, but we should say at this stage we're only mapping out a plan. In reality, we would be on hand throughout the year and be monitoring the situation and discussing making adjustments according to how things were playing out. It really is an ongoing collaboration, actually.
Great, but what about the other nutrients then? You've only really talked about nitrogen scheduling.
Yeah, the nitrogen scheduling is the most important thing to get right because it just dictates the growth responses. The level of supporting macro and micronutrition would be determined mainly with reference to soil analysis results. We tend to take a pragmatic sufficiency level approach, and we try not to set our target ranges too high. We only really want to apply what's necessary.
So what should our annual target for nitrogen actually be then, Henry?
Well, how long is a piece of string, Glenn? You actually just need to apply what's needed to support your own agronomic requirements. In the example, 110 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year seemed a reasonable aspiration for that particular scenario, but it'd be terrible for those fescue dominant links or fine grass dominant heathland settings. In reality, everyone's would be different. Some applying more, some applying less. We just need to do what's needed for each situation at any given time, and no more or less than that. And even then, your annual target is only just a ballpark figure, really, to keep you from going too far off the rails. The most important thing to do is to spend your nitrogen efficiently at any given time, and that means understanding your agronomic goals properly and your site characteristics and everything else that we mentioned, and then using the right technology to support those goals. And of course, we can help you with that.
And I'm sure you can, Henry.
Next junction, Glenn, sat finger is pointing you towards junction 47 and the A59 into Harrogate.
Yeah, I think I know where we are now, so you can put your sat finger away.
Well, you can't actually switch sat finger off, Glenn. It's a finger.
Oh, I can think of a way, Henry. You can...
Anyway, we haven't got long now, Glenn, have we? But just enough time for our monthly application tip of the month.
Don't worry, Henry, it's not a long one.
You are such a good man. So, Glenn, after the early arrival of winter in December, which took us all a little bit by surprise, the colder conditions have been with us potentially for up to 3 months now. So bearing that in mind, what useful application tip can you possibly have for us this month, Glenn?
Well, Henry, it has the potential to be one of the quieter times of the year from a sprayer point of view. But that doesn't mean that the top tips in the section that nobody listens to stop. We should now be thinking about how we've stored our products and what condition they are in. And I did some digging around on this one, Henry, because as we know, December was a tricky month from a temperature point of view.
Yeah.
And the standard advice is to store Syngenta products sat in a secure, compliant ChemSafe and keep them above 2 to 3 degrees. Which is good, solid advice. But I've seen a few greenkeepers' yards in my time, and very, very few have the ability to actually place their ChemSafe in a position that allows that to happen. Most of them are sat in the corner of a cold machinery shed, some are in steel lockups, some are just sat outside on a wash bay. So it's highly likely that some products out there will have dropped down below that 2 to 3 degrees, and very possibly in those cold periods they could have actually frozen. So I wanted to know what that actually means. What does it mean for the product? Because I really just don't like saying it froze, dispose of it. It just doesn't feel right.
No, it doesn't. So what's the deal then, Glenn?
Well, it turns out the impact of freezing is really determined by the formulation of the product. So there is no one answer fits all here. All products will react differently. First thing to note is if it's a powder or a granule, then it's fine. Freezing temperatures shouldn't impact those at all. But if it's a liquid, well, it's more tricky. All of our liquids are tested for freeze-thaw at production. And as we sell products in all sorts of different climates, I thought it was best to talk to my colleague Scott over in Canada to understand, because they deal with this all the time. And he was telling me that they freeze-thaw test 10 times and they don't see any loss of efficacy.
Well, that's fine then. No issue at all.
Well, it is with our products, but there are some watch outs. If it freezes, it can start to separate out in the bottle.
Okay, so you'll start to see layers maybe of the different constituents or co-formulant?
Yeah, that's right, which is bad news, because if it's not remixed properly, then you could have all of the active ingredients sat at the bottom and all of the co-formulants sat at the top, or the other way around. Just depends on how it's formulated. So applications then can easily fail. So it's really important that after cold weather, we really shake that bottle and agitate it as much as we can, because there is a chance that it could have fallen out of solution. Now we need a really decent shake here to ensure we get it back into solution. Now some will go into solution with a quick shake, others will take a long shake. Now if you can't get it back into solution, that's when we'd say it's not a usable product. And the real sign of trouble is after a good shake you still have crystals in that liquid. That is when you need to talk to your supplier. They can talk to us and there may be something we can do. But if you can't get it back into solution or there's crystals in there, don't use it. Talk to us. Like I say, Syngenta products are tested for this. So we're pretty confident on what we can do with it. But it's a real watch out for other products out there and something to really pay attention to, because I'm not aware of the level of testing that goes up with competitors' products.
Okay, so if a product freezes, it might not be all bad news.
That's right, but freezing will never help, Henry. It can speed up the rate of degradation that naturally happens. So warm storage will always help in the winter, but it isn't our number one concern.
Right, so what's that then?
Okay, our number one concern always remains operator exposure and risks to the environment. And a freezing bottle increases the risk of bursting. Again, Syngenta's S-Pack bottles are all tested for this, but not all packaging is. And we don't want anyone having to deal with split pesticide containers, that potentially can happen. And that frost thaw action can also lead to plastics becoming more brittle, leading to increased risk of those bottles fracturing and leaking in the future. Again, Syngenta S-Pack bottles are great here, but all plastics run this risk of becoming more fatigued with time. Every freeze situation increases the risk of unnecessary human exposure and risks to the environment.
Okay, so Glenn, as we approach Harrogate Town Centre, what's this month's tip?
Okay, we're getting closer now. Get yourself a small USB temperature data logger. It's kind of a thermometer that you stick somewhere. It records the temperature every 15 minutes and then you plug it into your computer. They're only about £15 on Amazon. Of course, other retailers are available. Get yourself one of those and put it in your ChemSafe to understand what's going on in there. Even if you're really confident you've got your ChemSafe set up well, it's a good record of how your product is stored should you have a problem. Next tip is good stock management. Really ask yourself, do you need to be storing that product over the winter? Can you reduce your stock levels during these cold times? And maybe you want to have a think to see if you could move your ChemSafe during the colder periods of the year to a warmer area of your yard. I know they're placed to get machines in and out a lot of the time, but in the winter when we're using machines less, is there a nice, convenient area that's a bit warmer where we could store them? Now, once you've considered all of those things and looked at it, but you've kind of convinced yourself that there is an opportunity to insulate or heat that, You can use that temperature logger to give you the numbers, so you can really see how cold it is getting in there. And that data you've collected using that data logger could be all the tools you need to go and ask for some investment in the clubhouse to help you get the right things for your ChemSafe. It could help you fund some heating installations or some way of insulating it or better facilities. Now, we want product that works, and we want safe operators, and we want to minimise the risk to the environment. Now is the time to think about those things.
It certainly is. Well, December was, as it turned out, but it's better late than never, Glenn.
Yeah, thanks, Henry.
So that's it, Glenn. We're here at your hotel car park in Harrogate, and what a journey. We managed to cover the whole of February in just 250 miles.
Yeah, and at times it felt much longer than that, Henry.
Well, not for me, Glenn. It simply flew by.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. There's nothing better than chewing the agronomic fat.
Indeed, Glenn.
Shall we get your bags out?
Well, I don't have any bags, Glenn. I live just over the hill, about half an hour away, so I tend to go home at the end of each day. I'll just take my car home.
But Henry, your car's at my house.
Oh yes, so it is. Oh dear, we didn't think that through, did we, Glenn?
No, we didn't.
But not a problem though. I'll just have to travel back with you on Thursday to pick it up. We can listen to On the...
No!